We're back, chat. And we're trying to finish our discussion of Rousseau here. I won't go too far deeper into the social contract. We're not going to touch book three or book four. Really, I just want to discuss briefly two ideas, and they're ideas that we actually touched on yesterday. I want to talk about a bit about the general will, and I want to distinguish it as far as I can from the idea of majority vote. Um, but then I also want to talk about another paradox that appears in the social contract. And this is going to speak to some of the issues that we talked about yesterday with respect to Rousseau's views on freedom. So yesterday we said that for Rousseau, freedom is tied up in the ability to make rules for ourselves. So one example that we discussed was the alarm clock. If my alarm clock goes off in the morning and it wakes me up and I don't like this and I would like to keep sleeping, but I am nonetheless compelled against my most ardent wishes to keep sleeping. I'm compelled to wake up. We would not say that this in any way, shape, or form makes me unfree, despite the fact that it clearly is a restraint on my desires, on my preferences. And the reason that this doesn't make me unfree is because it's a restraint that I've placed on myself. Um, so Rousseau has a view of freedom that is very strongly associated with the idea of autonomy. Auto, meaning self, nomy, Nomy, which is derived from the Greek nomos or nomoi, meaning sort of customs or laws. So to be an autonomous being is to be self-governing in the sense of laying down laws, laying down rules for oneself. So, for example, the way that we talk about AI, we have not yet reached autonomous AI, or at least not we haven't acknowledged that we've reached autonomous AI. And what we mean by this is like, despite how smart AI has become, despite how useful it's become, despite how apparently like human intelligence AI has become, it nonetheless follows rules that are not set by itself, at least the current iterations of it. Um, in other words, it refers to a set, well, not refers to, it operates according to a set of guidelines and parameters that are set by others. So, despite its intelligence, it's not autonomous. When I set an alarm for myself, that's an expression of autonomy. I'm setting a rule for myself. When I say I'm not going to drink on weeknights, when I say I'm not going to hang out with this person anymore, when I say I'm going to, work, 3 hours a day on this or that particular thing. These are all restraints that I've placed on myself. So they're all restraints, and we might think of them as being freedom limiting in that sense. I'm no longer free, as it were, to drink on the weeknights. Maybe I've even taken like exaggerated steps so that I won't drink on weeknights. Maybe I've locked up my liquor cabinet and given the key to someone else. Maybe I've set the liquor cabinet to a password that I can't remember. Maybe I've banished all booze from my house. Maybe I've elected to go live in a cabin in the woods somewhere and just completely and totally abandon any opportunity I might have to have booze. No matter how seriously I've taken this, what I've done is I've deprived myself of a certain freedom, the freedom to drink, but I'm not less free because I've done it to myself. Right? It's an expression of autonomy. And for Rousseau, not just it's not just that I'm not free, that setting rules for myself is itself an expression of freedom. It's a kind of freedom that, for example, is not available to animals. And this is extremely important for understanding for Rousseau the difference between uh, natural man, the first character that we saw in the first discourse, in the second discourse, with subsequent versions of man, savage man and civilized man. Only once we've begun to live socially with one another, only once we begin to take on obligations can we become a moral being, right? So morality for Rousseau has to do with adhering to and honoring obligations. That's what morality is. Natural man is not moral because he doesn't have any obligations. He doesn't have any language. He doesn't have any concepts. He doesn't have any people to feel obligated to, right? So natural man is not free, except in the way that animals are free, right? So are animals free? I guess they're free, kind of, right? So like a fish in a stream is free to swim this way or that, but we don't normally think of this as being like freedom, freedom. He's still an animal. Whereas developed humans exhibiting signs of developed consciousness are free to choose on the one hand, which means they're free to choose to obey certain rules. Um, so we saw for Rousseau that because freedom can be understood in terms of autonomy, we can square the circle of how we can commit ourselves to live under a state in which we are subject to commands, right? In which we're subject to law, how we can commit ourselves to living in a state while remaining, as he phrases it, while remaining as free as we were before. And the way that we do that is by so fully identifying with the state, so fully absorbing our own particular and private will into the general will, that when it rules, when it acts, it's as if we ourselves are acting. So if I can see the speed limit, or if I can see the tax brackets, or if I can see this or that statute pertaining to this or that activity, if I can see these as rules that I have laid down for myself in the same way that my rule not to drink on the weeknights is a rule that I've laid down for myself. If I can make that connection, then I'm not made unfree by these rules. I'm, on the one hand, offered all the protection of a state, and on the other hand, I remain as free as I was previously. Now, this leads us to another paradox. It's pretty much where we left off last session. So we've actually looked at two paradoxes thus far. We looked at the initial one that he led off with in chapter one, man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. There's the second paradox, which is the one he expresses in book one, chapter six, about how can we become subject to a state and yet remain as free as we were before. And here we have a third paragraph. I'm sorry, a third paradox, which appears here on page 58 at the end of chapter 7. Here's where he writes the following. In order, therefore, excuse me, in order, therefore, that the social pact should not be an empty formula, it contains an implicit obligation which alone can give force to the others. But if anyone refuses to obey the general will, he will be compelled to do so by the whole body, which means nothing else than he will be forced to be free. For such is the condition which, giving each citizen to his country, guarantees that he will not depend on any person. So here is another paradox, the idea that we can be forced to be free. So think back to the example that we just had about the promise to yourself not to drink on weeknights or something like that. So say you really mean this, you really want to make this commitment, not to drink on weeknights, and yet I don't know, you're a recovering alcoholic or something like that, and you don't trust yourself. You don't trust yourself to simply stop drinking on weeknights. So you go to your best friend and you're like, listen, you and me go way back. You're my BFF, my boo, and I need you to do something on my behalf. What I need you to do is to come in every morning and to measure uh, these bottles of alcohol to see if I drank any the night previously. And if I do drink some, I want you to whip me, really just beat the crap out of me, almost beat me within an inch of my life so that I won't do it again. So this is a pretty brutal arrangement. This is highly unusual. However, in this case, right, when the guy shows up, when your boo shows up the next morning and he notices that there's some vodka missing, and he makes good on his promise, he honors his oath, he honors the agreement that you made, and he beats you up. Now, in that case, has he made you unfree? Well, this is kind of weird because he's really, I mean, he beat the crap out of you. So this is a very bad thing to happen to someone. Not only did he beat the crap out of you, but he also beat the crap out of you uh, because of something that you did, and he beat the crap out of you in order to change your future behavior. So you would think that this is this meets all of the classical definitions of like coercion. So this would seem again to be something that runs contrary to your freedom, and yet if we understand freedom as like the ability to make rules for ourselves and the ability to take those rules seriously, then in fact, when he beats you up for drinking, he's not actually depriving you of your freedom. What he's doing is he's taking you seriously as a free being. He's taking you seriously as an agent who is capable of making rules for themselves. If he showed up the next morning and he noticed some vodka was missing, and he's like, oh my God, this guy's a recovering alcoholic. He's such a loser. He can't even stop himself from drinking, even when he makes rules for himself. I just feel too bad for him. I feel too bad for him, and I'm not going to do anything about it. Now think about it. This is the way that we treat children, right? So if a child, if a 7 or 8 year old commits on accident or even commits on purpose some weird crime, right? So gets in his parents' truck and drives it, into a building or something like that. We don't punish them like an adult. And the reason we don't punish them like an adult is because we say they're not fully responsible for themselves. And what that means is we don't treat kids like adults. And what we don't do is we don't take them seriously as agents. We don't take them seriously as free uh, as free beings, as free creatures. They're still developing. They're still in tutelage, as it were, and they can't be taken seriously. They can't face the responsibilities of their actions fully yet because they aren't free. So if this guy shows up and refuses to punish you in the way that you specified for the actions that you've undertaken, then he's refusing to take you seriously. And in this case, really what he's doing is he's refusing the conditions of your freedom, of your ability to set terms for your own life. And this is essentially what Rousseau is suggesting here, right? If if we go back to that grain farmer example, if you know, the public reaches its decision and it's decided that the policy will be that all the grain will be requisitioned and they come to take your grain. And at the very last second, you just can't bring yourself to do it. You're like, this is going to ruin me. And yesterday, when we decided on this, I felt like I could channel the general will. And I saw how this was in the best interest of everyone. And I saw how this was perfectly consistent with the general will that emerges from the general interest. And yet, now that you're here and now that you're about to take all my stuff, I just can't bring myself to do this. And at that point, you close your barn and you tell them to go away, and you're like, I'm not going to give it up willingly. Well, at that point, Rousseau says, at that point, if they, throw you to the ground, put you in shackles, take you to the guillotine, whatever it happens to be, even though this seems like unfreedom, even though this seems pretty bad from the perspective of freedom, because here's a mob that is chaining you to the barn or taking you to the guillotine because you won't give them your stuff, even though that's the case, all they're doing when they punish you like this, all they're doing is taking your moral commitments seriously. All they're doing is taking you seriously as a moral being. In that case, all they're doing, as Rousseau would phrase it, all they're doing is forcing you to be free. So this is an important paradox, and it's an important idea. And the question set's going to ask you about this. And if you don't get this, email me. But getting this and getting how we can be as free as we were before, even after entering the state, if you can understand these two key concepts, you can pretty much get what Rousseau's doing in the Civic Contract. I also just want to point you to the first three or four chapters in book two. These are very brief. It'll only take you a few minutes to read through them. But he basically establishes the boundaries of sovereignty as he conceives them. So, as we discussed yesterday, one thing to note is that Rousseau, like Hobbes, has a theory of absolute sovereignty. But unlike Hobbes, this sovereignty is not something that we alienate to some person or some assembly of people, namely the sovereign. Rather, it is a sovereignty that we all have an equal and active share in. But even though we have an equal and active share in it, it is nonetheless absolute, right? So it resides always in the people, which means, right, Rousseau is not advocating for something like pure democratic participation, right? He's not saying that the people should assemble in every single case in which something needs to be decided. He's not suggesting that. The people can, in fact, elect a government. And in fact, in books 3 and 4 of the Social Contract, Rousseau has plenty to say about what kind of government would be best, what shape it should take, what the law should look like, et cetera, et cetera. But the sovereignty which empowers that government never resides with the government. It resides always, permanently, inalterably with the people. And so if the people wake up tomorrow and for whatever reason whatsoever, if they wake up tomorrow and the general will has changed, such as they no longer want this government anymore, they have they have a perfect right to throw this government off and to otherwise alter and abolish it. But I real quick wanted to say something about the general will in just the way that he specifies what it is here in chapter three. Um, uh, so it's the case that the general, so this chapter is called Whether the General Will Can Err. And the question that he's asking here is whether or not the general will can be wrong. So this is interesting. For Rousseau, the general will can make mistakes, but it cannot be wrong in the same way that an individual. So we might make mistakes about what's in our interest, but we can't actually be wrong about what's in our interest because ultimately we are the arbiters of our interest. So I'll give you example of like uh, actually just take the drinking example, right? So, you know, there's lots of different views on like whether or not drinking is good. So, some people are teetotalers. There's actually, I feel like in the last 4 or 5 movement, or last 4 or 5 years, there's been a movement even among young people to abstain entirely from alcohol. There's, temperance movements. There have been a lot of, sort of stridently anti-alcohol movements in the past who think that drinking is a real sin or just a bad thing to do in almost all cases, whether for health reasons or for moral reasons. And there have also been those who think that drinking is good. So you have like, just actual, drunken sots like Charles Bukowski or something like that. But then you also have sort of moderate drinkers like uh, somebody like Ben Franklin saying that that beer is evidence that God loves us and this kind of stuff. So in other words, those who see access to alcohol and sort of drinking with friends is part and parcel of like a good life. So in other words, there's disagreement about whether or not drinking is acceptable, by which I mean sort of morally acceptable. Um, what Rousseau is saying is like what your view on that is, whether or not drinking is permissible, whether or not drinking, in other words, is in your interest as a person. Ultimately, the only arbiter of that is going to be you. So you can't be like wrong or right about whether drinking is right for you in the sense that like if you have a vision of life that says what I want to do is to have fun with my friends or whatever, and drinking is part of that, then like that's your view, that's your interest, and you can't really be wrong about that. There isn't any outside authority that can say with 100% certainty, yes, drinking is morally permissible or no, drinking is not morally permissible. So you ultimately are the only arbiter of whether drinking is morally permissible for you. At the same time, you might be mistaken about like what quantity of drinking is right. You might be mistaken about what counts as drinking. So there's been like this huge like explosion in like seltzers in these weird sort of like water-based alcoholic drinks. And so maybe you're under the illusion that like when I say I'm a teetotaler, what I mean is like just no beer or just no hard liquor or something like that. And so, I mean, you could imagine someone who suffered from this weird delusion or someone who thinks that vaping isn't really smoking or something like that. In that case, they're not mistaken about sort of whether or not drinking is right for them, but they are mistaken about like the facts of the matter, right? They're mistaken about how to get the thing that they want. To take I guess, a more anodyne example, right? Like whether or not you want to be a healthy person, like an optimally healthy person, is up to you. But whether or not whether or not eating large amounts of saturated fats will lead to you being a healthy or not, or person or not, that's a thing about which you can be mistaken, right? I hope you guys can see this distinction because Rousseau wants to say that the general will can be right or wrong in the same way. So the general will can never be wrong about what the general will is, right? It can never be wrong about what is in the general interest because it simply is the general interest. It only ever refers to itself. There is no outside standard by which it can be evaluated, but it can be mistaken about what that will requires. So a classic example of this would be something like the disastrous Syracusan expedition that the Athenians undertook in the Peloponnesian War. So on the one hand, it was clearly the will of Athens that they wanted to win the war over Sparta, right? So like whether or not beating Sparta in a war was right for Athens isn't really for anyone to say except the Athenians. what the people of Athens wanted was to win this war, and they can't be wrong about that because it's simply what they are, what they want, right? The general will was we must win this war. However, the Syracusan expedition was a friggin' disaster. So in this case, they were mistaken about what was required. They were given a bunch of public speeches by, um, these sort of boisterous and charismatic young men who sold them on this bad idea, and so they got misled. They were mistaken about what the general will requires, but that doesn't mean that they were wrong about what was actually in the general will. So Rousseau wants to make this distinction. He wants to say the general will can never be wrong, but it can from time to time err, ERR. It can make mistakes, which is why the general will ought to seek out advice, right? It ought to seek out counselors. It ought to seek out wise and impartial legislators who can help it shape and enact its general will more and more effectively. All right. So we'll leave off there today. We will pick up a few pieces that we have lying around here with Rousseau in our discussion tomorrow of Marx and Engels. In the meantime, get caught up on your question sets. Email me with any questions or concerns you might have, and uh, we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.